Clara Whitfield signed her name on a stranger's marriage contract with her brother's debt notice pressed flat beneath her palm, and she did not cry. Not once. Not even when the ink dried and the rancher's lawyer folded the paper without looking at her face. She had come to Harlan Ridge to save her family. She had not come to feel anything, but the cowboy at the end of that long table never touched the contract. He just watched her with eyes that already knew something she didn't. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stage road into Harlan Ridge cut through summer rangeland so dry the dust rose without wind. Clara Whitfield sat rigid on the wooden bench inside the coach, her back straight, her hands folded over the worn leather satchel in her lap. She had not slept since Millbrook. She had not eaten since the morning before that. What she had done every mile of the 3-day journey was think. She had thought about her brother Daniel, 22 years old, and already hollowed out by a debt he hadn't understood when he signed it. She had thought about her younger brother Thomas, 16, who still believed that things had a way of working out. She had thought about her father's grave outside Millbrook, the headstone half sunk into ground that no longer belonged to her family. And she had thought very carefully about what she was riding toward. A marriage contract. A man she had never met. A ranch called the Harlan Ridge Cattle Concern, owned by one Garrett Calloway, 38 years old, unmarried, described in the lawyer's letter as a man of property and stable character. The letter had not described his face, his voice, or whether he was kind. The lawyer had not seemed to think those things were relevant. Clara had decided somewhere around the second day that they were not relevant to her either. First time to Harlan Ridge, miss. The man across from her was broad gray-bearded, wearing a cattleman's coat darkened at the shoulders with old sweat. He had the eyes of someone who asked questions to fill silence rather than to hear answers. Yes, Clara said. You got family out here? She looked at the window. I will. The man nodded slowly, reading something in her tone that told him to stop asking. He looked back out his own window. The coach lurched over a rut, and Clara gripped the satchel tighter. Inside it were 3 things: a copy of the marriage contract, a letter from her brother Daniel written in his cramped, anxious handwriting, and a small photograph of her mother taken 6 years ago before the sickness. Clara had not opened the photograph since Millbrook. She was afraid that if she looked at her mother's face right now, she would not be able to keep the expression she had been practicing since she boarded the coach. Composed, capable, not afraid. Harlan Ridge was larger than she had expected and smaller than she had hoped. It had 2 general stores, a telegraph office, a church with a new bell tower, a saloon with a painted sign she didn't read, and a main street long enough to feel like a real town, but short enough that everyone on it could see everyone else's business. The coach stopped in front of the post office. Clara was the only passenger who stepped down with no one waiting for her. She stood in the summer dust with her satchel over one arm and her traveling bag at her feet, and looked at the town looking back at her. 3 women on the far boardwalk had paused their conversation. A man outside the barber shop leaned against the post and watched her with the particular attention of someone who already knew who she was. She picked up her traveling bag. She walked toward the lawyer's office, which the letter had identified as the meeting point. She did not look left or right. She had learned in the years since her father's reputation had begun to crack under the weight of bad harvests and borrowed money that the best way to move through a town that was already deciding what it thought of you was to give it nothing to read. Straight back, level eyes, steady pace. The lawyer's office was on the second cross street, a narrow building wedged between a feed store and what appeared to be a land registry. The door was open. Clara stepped inside. The man behind the desk was not the lawyer. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a hat he had not taken off, which told her he hadn't planned to stay long. He was standing rather than sitting, one hand resting on the back of the desk chair, looking at a paper on the desk. He had dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been set hard and left that way, and a scar that ran from the edge of his left eyebrow toward his temple, old and faded. He looked up when she came in. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "You're Clara Whitfield." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He straightened. He reached up and took off his hat in a single unhurried motion. Garrett Calloway. She had known that. She had somehow not expected it to feel like information the moment he said it. "Where is Mr. Alcott?" she asked. Alcott was the lawyer. "He'll be back in an hour. He had business at the bank." Garrett Calloway set his hat on the corner of the desk. "You want to sit down? You've been on a coach for 3 days." "I'm fine standing." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way the women on the boardwalk had looked at her reading her clothes and her bag and her posture for evidence of something. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, without making assumptions. Then he nodded. "All right." He sat down in the chair himself, which surprised her. Most men in her experience remained standing when a woman chose to stand, performing a kind of courtesy that was really a form of pressure. She set her traveling bag down next to the wall. She did not sit, but she stopped gripping the satchel quite so hard. "You had a long trip," he said. "Yes." "You eat anything today?" She paused. "That isn't relevant to the contract." Something moved across his face. Not amusement exactly. Something quieter. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He opened the desk drawer, took out a folded cloth, and set it on the corner of the desk closest to her. When she didn't move, he said, "Biscuits. Mrs. Harlan made them this morning. I haven't touched them." Clara looked at the cloth. She looked at him. "I'm not hungry," she said. "All right," he said again. He left the cloth where it was. Mr. Alcott returned 40 minutes later, slightly out of breath with ink on his left hand, and the practiced cheerfulness of a man who made his living mediating between people who did not want to be in the same room. "Miss Whitfield, you made excellent time. Mr. Calloway, I see you've already introduced yourselves. Good. He settled behind the desk and spread the contract between them, and for the next 20 minutes he talked about terms. Clara listened carefully to every word. She had read the contract 3 times on the coach. She read everything twice, a habit her father had started teaching her when she was 9 before the debts began, when he had still believed that a woman who understood legal language was a woman who could protect herself. The terms were what she had agreed to. A legal marriage. Access to the Calloway Ranch and its resources for the duration. Her brother's debt, $460, owed to the Harlan Ridge Cattle Concern, canceled upon signing. A separate household arrangement within the ranch property, which the contract called private quarters for Miss Whitfield to be maintained at Mr. Calloway's expense. That last part had surprised her the first time she read it. Most marriage contracts in the territory did not include a separate household arrangement. Most marriage contracts in the territory assumed the point was proximity. She had not asked about it in her letters. She asked about it now. "The separate quarters," she said, cutting across something Alcott was saying about livestock inheritance clauses. Whose idea was that? Alcott blinked. He looked at Garrett Calloway. Calloway was watching her. "Mine," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you didn't choose this," he said. "You chose what came with it. That's not the same thing." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at Alcott. "Continue," she said. She signed the contract. Garrett Calloway signed below her. Alcott witnessed it and pressed his seal into the wax, and that was that. 3 years of her brother's desperate correspondence. 6 months of negotiations she had conducted by letter from Millbrook, and 1 3-day coach ride across summer rangeland, all collapsed into 30 minutes and 2 signatures. Alcott shook Calloway's hand, then turned to shake Clara's, which she accepted because refusing would have made a scene she didn't need. Outside, the summer heat had deepened into late afternoon, and the main street of Harlan Ridge was fuller than it had been when she arrived. She stood on the boardwalk with her traveling bag and her satchel and tried to decide what she felt. Nothing, she decided. Good. That was the intention. "My wagon's at the livery," Garrett said from beside her. "I know how to walk to a livery," she said. "I expect you do." He picked up her traveling bag before she could object. She opened her mouth. He said without looking at her, "I've got 2 hands, and you've been carrying that since Millbrook. This isn't a statement about anything." She closed her mouth. She walked beside him. The wagon ride to the Calloway Ranch took the better part of an hour through rangeland that opened up as the road climbed toward the mountain foothills. The summer grass was bleached gold, and the shadows of the peaks stretched long across it. Clara sat on the wagon bench with her satchel in her lap and watched the land and did not make conversation. Garrett drove. He did not make conversation either. At one point, a hawk crossed above them, low and unhurried, and Clara tracked it until it dropped behind a ridge. When she looked back at the road, she found Garrett had been watching her. He looked forward again immediately. She filed that away and said nothing. The ranch house was not what she had expected. She had built a picture from the lawyer's letters, a wealthy man's property, substantial, possibly ostentatious in the way that men who had come from nothing and built something often made their houses. She had prepared herself for something that would make her feel the imbalance of their arrangement very clearly. The house was large enough to be serious and plain enough to be honest. 2 stories wood and stone, the porch running the full front length, with 2 chairs that had clearly been sat in regularly. The barn was newer than the house, well kept. The water trough near the gate was full and clean. A woman came out of the house as they pulled in. Stout 60s gray hair pinned back under a work cloth. She stopped at the porch steps and looked at Clara the way Clara had been looked at all day, except that this look had something different in it. Not judgment. Something closer to assessment. "Mrs. Bryn," Garrett said, climbing down. "This is Miss Whitfield, Clara." "I can see that," Mrs. Bryn said. She looked at Clara on the wagon bench. "Can you get down yourself, or do you want a hand?" "I can get down myself," Clara said, and did. Mrs. Bryn nodded. "Your room is ready. It's got a window that faces east, so you'll get the morning cool before the heat. Supper's at 6. She looked at Garrett. "You're late. The fence on the north pasture needs looking at before dark." "I know," he said. "Then go look at it." She turned back to Clara. "Come inside. I'll show you where things are." Clara looked once at Garrett Calloway, who was already turning toward the barn. He did not look back. She followed Mrs. Bryn into the house. The room was small and clean and faced east as promised. It had a bed with a real quilt, a washstand, a chair, and a window that looked out toward the mountain line. Someone had put a small vase of dried summer grass on the windowsill. It looked like it had been done in a hurry, and then reconsidered and left anyway. Clara set her bags down. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the dried grass. She thought about Daniel's letter. She had read it so many times that she could recite it without looking. "Clara, I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't fair. If there was any other way, I would have found it. You've always been the strong one. I'm sorry I needed you to be strong again." She had not written back to tell him what she thought of being called the strong one. She had written back to say she was going, and he should take care of Thomas, and they should not worry about her. She had meant the last part as a fact, not a comfort. She genuinely could not afford for them to worry about her because worry took energy, and energy was finite, and she needed every piece of it for what she had come here to do, which was survive this, keep her family out of debt. And eventually, when the contract was fulfilled, or the terms were renegotiated, or some other door opened, find her way back to something that belonged to her. She was not here to feel things. She was not here to notice a man's eyes or the way he carried her bag without making it into a gesture. She was not here to look at dried grass on a windowsill and wonder who had put it there. She stood up. She unpacked her traveling bag with efficient, practiced movements. She placed the marriage contract in the bottom of the satchel under her father's old ledger book, which she had brought because its pages were mostly blank and she used it for notes. She placed her mother's photograph on the windowsill next to the dried grass. Then she washed her face, straightened her collar, and went down to supper. Supper was Garrett Calloway, Clara Whitfield, Mrs. Bryn, and a young ranch hand named Pete, who appeared to be about 18, and looked at Clara with the transparent amazement of someone who had not expected a woman to appear at this table. Garrett had not looked at her like that. Garrett looked at her the way he had looked at her all afternoon, carefully, with the expression of someone withholding judgment and not particularly in a hurry to form one. Mrs. Bryn served roast meat and summer corn and bread, and did not appear to think the occasion required any particular acknowledgement. Pete said, "You come from Millbrook, miss?" "My cousin lives in Millbrook. Do you know the Danes over on the East Road?" "I know of them," Clara said. She did not know them. She had lived in Millbrook for 3 years and knew almost no one, because keeping to yourself when your family's reputation was sliding was both a survival instinct and a form of grief. "Nice people," Pete said helpfully. "I'm sure they are," Clara said. Garrett said nothing. He ate with the efficiency of a man who worked long days and didn't spend his meals thinking about anything except what he needed to do afterward. At one point, Mrs. Bryn said, "The church ladies will want to call on you. I'd give it 3 days before someone shows up with a pie." "I'm not much for pie," Clara said. "That isn't the point of the pie," Mrs. Bryn said, and went back to her food. Clara glanced at Garrett. He was looking at his plate. After supper, while Mrs. Bryn and Pete cleared, Garrett stood by the door pulling on his coat and said, "There are books in the front room if you want them. Mrs. Bryn can tell you where things are if you need anything. The ranch gets up early." "I'm aware of what early looks like," Clara said. He put on his hat. "Good night, Miss Whitfield." "Good night, Mr. Calloway." He went out. The door closed. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots on the porch, and then the sound of them moving away toward the barn. She could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept well in 2 years, not since the first creditor's letter had arrived, and she had understood, reading between the legal lines with the skill her father had given her, that the situation was worse than Daniel knew. She had developed the habit of lying still in the dark and thinking through problems with a methodical patience that probably looked from the outside like peace. Tonight, she thought about the contract. She had been thinking about one specific clause since she signed it. A clause she had noticed the first time she read the contract in Millbrook, but had not fully understood. It concerned a property right attached to the Calloway Ranch's northern range, a water access agreement, very old, written in the formal language of an earlier period of territorial law. The clause transferred, upon marriage, to the estate of both parties jointly. This was unusual. Water rights in the territory were typically held individually and did not merge through marriage without specific negotiation. The clause was written as though it had always been there, a standard part of the ranch's legal foundation. But Clara had read enough old contracts and land agreements in the years she'd spent helping her father manage what remained of their property to know that standard did not mean simple. And the language in this clause was not quite standard. It had been inserted, she was almost certain of it, and inserted recently because the ink shading was slightly different from the surrounding text, in a way that would not have been visible to someone who wasn't looking for it. She had not mentioned this to Alcott. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She had signed the contract because Daniel needed the debt canceled, and she had no other move, but she had filed the clause away in the part of her mind where she kept things that required more information before they could be properly understood. She lay in the dark in the east-facing room and thought about the clause, and thought about Garrett Calloway, and thought about what kind of man built a separate household arrangement into a marriage contract to protect a woman he had never met. She thought about water rights. She thought about Silas Crowley, whose name had appeared in Daniel's last letter in a context that had made her uneasy. Crowley was the man who held the original debt paper on Daniel's loan. He was also, according to one of Daniel's panicked postscripts, the man who had brokered the marriage contract arrangement in the first place, or at least who had been present at the meeting where it was first proposed. She had not asked Alcott about Crowley's involvement. She had planned to, and then she had sat across the desk from Garrett Calloway and looked at his face and decided she needed more information before she asked any question out loud. The mountain wind came through the window she had cracked open, dry and cool, carrying the smell of summer grass and high elevation. She lay in the dark and breathed and thought. And somewhere around midnight, she made herself stop thinking and simply be still. Because she knew from experience that the problems that looked impossible at midnight had a way of looking merely very difficult by morning. In the morning, she decided she would begin to look more carefully at things. She was up before the house stirred. She washed, dressed, and went downstairs to find the kitchen empty and the fire already banked low with a coffee pot sitting warm at its edge, which told her that Garrett Calloway had been up even before her. She poured herself coffee and stood at the kitchen window. He was in the yard working with a length of fence rail and what appeared to be a post that had split at the base. He was doing it alone, methodically, the way he seemed to do most things. He had his sleeves rolled back and was using a mallet with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Clara watched him for a moment. Then she looked away, because there was no useful information in watching a man work, and she had not come here to find useful information in Garrett Calloway. She took her coffee and went to the front room where the books were kept. The front room was spare and functional, like the rest of the house. 2 shelves of books, mostly practical surveying animal husbandry, 2 volumes of territorial law, a small desk in the corner, and on the desk, held flat by a smooth river stone, a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded enough times to show its creases even from across the room. Clara did not go to the desk. She was not a person who went through other people's papers. But she could read the return address on the outer fold from where she stood. Harlan Ridge Land Registry Office, dated 2 months ago. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at the bookshelves and took down the first volume of territorial law. She was sitting in the chair by the window reading it when Mrs. Bryn came downstairs 40 minutes later and stopped in the doorway. "You sleep at all?" Mrs. Bryn asked. "Some," Clara said, which was not quite a lie. Mrs. Bryn looked at the book in her lap. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not quite surprise. More like recognition. "Your father was a record keeper," she said. It was not a question. Clara looked up. "How did you know that?" Mrs. Bryn said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Breakfast in 20 minutes," and went back to the kitchen. Clara looked at the doorway where Mrs. Bryn had been. She looked at the territorial law volume in her hands. She looked at the letter on the desk. She thought, "There is something in this house that someone does not want found. And someone else in this house already knows it." She turned back to her page. Outside, the steady rhythm of Garrett Calloway's mallet continued patient and unhurried, while the summer morning came over the mountain in full light. And Clara Whitfield, who had come to Harlan Ridge to survive, and nothing more, began very quietly to pay attention to everything. The letter on the desk stayed where it was. Clara did not touch it that morning. She finished her coffee, ate breakfast without conversation, and spent the first half of the day doing what she had told herself she came here to do: learn the shape of the place she was now legally attached to. She walked the yard, noted the condition of the well, watched how Mrs. Bryn managed the household stores, and asked 3 practical questions about the weekly supply run to town. She did not ask anything she wasn't ready to know the answer to. But the letter stayed in her mind the way a splinter stays in a finger, not always painful, but never fully ignorable. By the second afternoon, she understood the ranch's daily rhythm well enough to move through it without bumping into anyone unexpectedly. Garrett was gone from first light until the heat of midday, then back briefly, then out again until supper. Pete handled the livestock in the mornings and the equipment in the afternoons. Mrs. Bryn ran the house with the quiet authority of a woman who had been doing it for years and had long ago stopped explaining herself. Clara helped with his kitchen work without being asked. Mrs. Bryn did not thank her for this, which Clara respected. Gratitude implied surprise. She did not want to be a surprise in this house. She wanted to be a fact. On the 3rd morning, she was in the front room again when she heard Garrett come in earlier than usual. He came through the back, and she heard water. Then the sound of him in the kitchen, then silence. Then his boots in the hallway. He stopped in the doorway. "You're up early again," he said. "I wake early," she said. "I didn't think it would be an inconvenience." "It isn't." He looked at the book in her lap. That's territorial water law. Yes. Most people don't read that for pleasure. I don't read it for pleasure, she said. I read it because I want to understand something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the other chair, the one closer to the desk, the one with the river stone and the letter, and looked at her with that same careful, withheld expression. What do you want to understand? He asked. Clara looked at him steadily. The water rights clause in our contract, the one that transfers jointly on marriage. Something changed in his face. It was small, barely visible, but she caught it, the slight tightening around the eyes, the fractional shift of his jaw. What about it? He said. It was added, she said. The ink is different, not dramatically, but enough. Someone inserted that clause after the original contract was drafted. The silence between them had a different quality now. Garrett Calloway looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because she was generally good at reading people. Who showed you that? He asked. No one showed me. I noticed it. He looked at the book in her lap again. Then he looked at the window. How much do you know about water rights in this territory? Enough, she said. Who controls the spring on the North Ridge? His jaw set. I do. My father claimed it in 1858. It's recorded. And if that claim were challenged, it wouldn't be. But he said it one beat too late. One beat too firm, the way people say things they have been telling themselves rather than things they are certain of. Clara set the book on her knee. Mr. Calloway, I'm not your enemy. I'm also not a woman who functions well without information. If there is something in this contract I should understand, I would like to understand it. Garrett Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said Crowley, just the one word, like he had been holding it behind his back and had finally decided to put it on the table. Tell me, Clara said. He told her in pieces the way people tell things they haven't told anyone before, not in order. With gaps, she had to listen around. Silas Crowley had been a cattle broker in Harlan Ridge for 11 years. He had started with money, which in the territory meant he had started with leverage, and leverage in the right hands became land, and land became water, and water. In summer, rangeland was the closest thing to power that existed outside a courthouse. Crowley had been trying to acquire the water rights to Calloway's North Ridge Spring for 3 years. The spring fed 2 seasonal creeks that crossed 4 properties, and whoever held the rights to the spring controlled in practical terms the water access of every family on those 4 properties during dry season. Garrett had refused every offer. Last winter, Crowley had found a different approach. He had produced a document origin unclear, authenticated by a land registry clerk who had since moved to another territory, claiming that the original 1858 spring claim had a legal defect. Not fabricated outright. More elegant than that. A filing error in the original survey, one that could be argued in territorial court to render the claim provisional rather than permanent. Provisional claims could be contested. Contested claims had resolution procedures. Resolution procedures took time, and during that time, the rights were in dispute, and disputed rights could be leveraged, purchased, or with the right judge, at the right moment reassigned. Garrett had hired a lawyer. The lawyer had told him the defect was likely a fabrication, but was difficult to disprove without the original survey documents which were held in a regional archive 2 territories away. Then the marriage contract had appeared. Clara listened to all of this without interrupting. When he stopped, she said, "Who brought you the contract?" Alcott. He said a family in Millbrook needed debt relief and was offering a marriage arrangement in exchange. And you agreed. Garrett looked at her. I agreed to the arrangement. I put in the separate quarters clause before I signed anything. You didn't answer my question, Clara said quietly. You agreed. Why? Something moved across his face that was not quite pain and not quite anger. It was the expression of a man who had made a decision he didn't enjoy and was not going to apologize for. I needed the joint property clause as protection. If Crowley challenges the spring claim, a jointly held marriage record creates a secondary legal standing. 2 claimants are harder to displace than one. Clara absorbed this. You use the contract as a legal shield. Yes. And my brother's debt is canceled. That part is real. He met her eyes. I'm not going to tell you I did this entirely for your family's sake, Miss Whitfield. I'm telling you what it is. Clara sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Daniel's letter. She thought about the way Alcott had looked at her when she arrived, the careful cheerfulness of a man who knew more than he was saying. She thought about the clause, and the ink that didn't quite match. Does Crowley know about the joint property clause? She asked. He will soon, if he doesn't already. And when he does, Garrett's voice was flat and even. He'll find another way to come at it. That's what he does. Clara looked at the letter on the desk. Is that from the land registry? Garrett followed her gaze. He didn't answer immediately. Mr. Calloway. Yes, he said. It arrived 6 weeks ago, before I agreed to the contract. What does it say? He stood up, crossed to the desk, picked up the letter. He held it for a moment, then held it out to her. Read it yourself. The letter was from the Harlan Ridge Land Registry Office. It was formal in language and very clear in intent. It informed Garrett Calloway that a petition had been filed by a Mr. Silas Crowley under Territorial Statute 44 Section 9, contesting the provisional status of the North Ridge Spring Claim. The petition requested a formal review hearing within 90 days. The letter was dated 8 weeks ago. 90 days. Clara did the arithmetic without effort. You have less than 2 weeks, she said. 12 days, Garrett said. And the original survey documents. I sent for them. The archive says they'll take another 3 weeks minimum. Clara looked at the letter again. Her mind was moving quickly, sorting through what she knew about territorial land law, which was not nothing, because her father had owned property, and she had learned the language of property law, the way you learn the language of any system you need to navigate in order to survive inside it. The joint property standing might hold a review hearing, she said slowly. It creates a complication Crowley's petition hasn't accounted for. Territorial Statute 44 covers individual claim contests. A jointly held claim has to be challenged under a different section entirely. Garrett looked at her. You know the statute. I know the book you had on your shelf. She set the letter down. It won't stop the review, but it might delay it long enough for the archive documents to arrive. The silence between them was different again. Not careful. Closer to something she didn't want to name. You could have told me this the day I arrived, she said. I could have, he said. I didn't know what you were. And now... He picked up his hat from the desk. Now I know you read territorial law at 6 in the morning because you noticed an ink variation in a legal document on your first day here. He paused at the doorway. I think that's probably enough information for one morning. He left. Clara sat in the empty room with the letter in her hands and the summer light coming through the window and the particular feeling of a situation rearranging itself into a shape she had not anticipated. She was not angry. Anger was a luxury she had stopped affording herself 2 years ago. What she felt was something colder and more useful, the understanding that she was in the middle of something larger than a marriage contract, and that she had signed her name to it, and that meant she was going to have to know all of it before she could decide what to do. She refolded the letter carefully and placed it back under the riverstone. Then she opened the territorial law volume to section 44 and began to read. The church women arrived on the 4th day exactly as Mrs. Bryn had predicted, and there were 3 of them, and they brought 2 pies which Clara suspected was a statement. Their names were Mrs. Alcott, the lawyer's wife, Mrs. Vance, who owned the dry goods store, and a younger woman named Helen Marsh, who smiled so continuously it appeared to require effort. They came in the afternoon and sat in the front room and accepted Mrs. Bryn's coffee and looked at Clara with the trained social warmth of women who had made an art form of extracting information without appearing to ask questions. You must be so relieved to have the journey behind you, Mrs. Alcott said. She had the careful eyes of a woman who had been a lawyer's wife long enough to understand what information looked like when it was being withheld. I'm settled in very well, Clara said. Mrs. Bryn has been very kind. Garrett must be pleased to have some help around the house, Mrs. Vance said. I wouldn't speak for Mr. Calloway's feelings, Clara said pleasantly. A tiny pause. Of course, Mrs. Vance said. He's always been a very private man. He seems very capable, Clara said, which was technically true and revealed nothing. Helen Marsh leaned forward slightly. We were all so surprised when we heard he was, that is when the arrangement was. She stopped, smiled harder. We didn't realize he was looking. I don't think he was, Clara said. Circumstances change. Another pause longer this time. Mrs. Alcott set down her coffee cup. Miss Whitfield, or I suppose Mrs. Calloway. Miss Whitfield is fine. Miss Whitfield, we're a small community. People talk. I want you to know that there's no judgment in this room. Clara looked at her. That's very kind. We just want to understand. Mrs. Alcott, Clara said very gently. I've traveled a long distance and signed a legal document, and I'm sitting in my front room drinking coffee with 3 women I met 4 minutes ago. I'm going to answer exactly as many questions as I feel like answering, and I'm going to do it with perfect courtesy, and I hope you'll extend me the same. Is that all right? The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Bryn from the kitchen doorway said, More coffee, ladies, in the tone of someone who had just watched a small satisfying event conclude. Mrs. Alcott looked at Clara with an expression that had changed. The social warmth was still there, but underneath it something else had surfaced. Not hostility. Closer to respect, the reluctant kind that appears when someone does something you didn't expect. Of course, Mrs. Alcott said. Tell me, do you have family in Millbrook? 2 brothers, Clara said. Yes. You must miss them. Every day, Clara said, and meant it, and let herself mean it, because sometimes the truest answer was also the safest one. That evening, after the church women had gone and the supper dishes were cleared, Clara found Mrs. Bryn sitting at the kitchen table with her mending and what appeared to be a small worn Bible open beside her. Clara sat down across from her. Mrs. Bryn kept sewing. How did you know about my father? Clara said. The needle kept moving. Didn't say I knew anything about your father. You said he was a record keeper. You said it like you knew him. Mrs. Bryn put down the mending. She looked at Clara with those assessment eyes, the ones that had looked at her on the first day, and Clara held very still under them, the way she'd learned to hold still under difficult looks. James Whitfield, Mrs. Bryn said. Clara's chest tightened. You knew him, knew of him. He wrote letters to the Territorial Land Office 15 years ago about a water rights dispute in the Eastern Range. Very detailed letters. I was working the church registry at the time, and we shared some records. She paused. He was a thorough man. He was, Clara said carefully. He died disgraced, Mrs. Bryn said, not cruelly, as a fact. Yes. The disgrace wasn't his. Clara looked at her. What do you know, Mrs. Bryn? The older woman picked up her mending again. I know that your father found something in the church relief records that someone didn't want found. I know that within 3 months of him finding it, the story about the missing money started, and within 6 months, he was called a thief in open meeting, and within the year he was dead. She pulled her thread through. I know the name of the man who started that story. The kitchen was very quiet. Crowley, Clara said. Mrs. Bryn didn't answer, but she didn't correct her either. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She was keeping them there on purpose. What did my father find? I don't know exactly. What I know is this. Mrs. Bryn set down the mending again, and this time she looked at Clara directly. There is a ledger, a church relief fund ledger from 1869. It should be in the registry archive. It isn't. It hasn't been there since the year your father died. The woman who was keeping the archive at that time said she gave it to a church official for safekeeping. That church official is no longer in this territory. But the ledger still exists, Clara said. I believe so. Where? That, Mrs. Bryn said, picking up her mending for the final time. I truly do not know. If I did, I would have done something about it 10 years ago. Clara sat with this. She thought about her father's last letter, the one he had written 2 weeks before he died, the one Daniel had given her after the funeral, because Daniel hadn't known what to do with it. She had read it so many times, she had worn the creases soft. In it, her father had written, "I have found what they hid. I have not yet found where they hid themselves. There is a difference, and that difference is the danger." She had not understood it when she first read it. She thought she was beginning to understand it now. "Mrs. Bryn," she said, "did you know who I was when Garrett agreed to this arrangement?" The older woman's needle paused for exactly 1 stitch. "I knew your name. I made a connection." "Did you tell him?" "No." "Why not?" Mrs. Bryn looked up. "Because I wanted to see what you would do first." Clara did not sleep that night either. But this time she wasn't thinking through abstractions. She was reconstructing a timeline. Her father had been a land record keeper in the Eastern Territories in the late 1860s. He had found something in the Church Relief Fund records, money redirected, she suspected, or records falsified, or both. He had been ruined before he could act on it. He had died with the knowledge half-formed. Silas Crowley had been in the Eastern Territories in the late 1860s. He had moved to Harlan Ridge approximately 12 years ago, which was 1 year after her father's disgrace. He had built his operation here on debt papers, land claims, and water rights. He was now trying to take the spring claim from Garrett Calloway using a fabricated survey defect. The same man, the same methods, a longer reach. Clara lay very still in the dark and thought about the ledger. If her father had found it, he would have known where it was being kept. He had not been able to tell anyone directly, not without risking everything, before he had the evidence secured. But her father had been a thorough man, as Mrs. Bryn said. He had been the kind of man who made sure of things. He had written her a letter. She got up, lit the small lantern, and opened the satchel. Under the marriage contract, under the blank ledger book, in the very bottom, folded into the lining, was her father's last letter. She unfolded it in the lantern light and read the last paragraph again. She had always focused on the line about the danger. Tonight, she read the line before it. "I have placed what I found where it belongs among the records that remember everything, even when the people forget. If you ever need it, look where the truth always lives, in the place no one checks anymore, because everyone assumes it's empty." Clara looked at the words for a long time. She thought about church registries, about archives that had been there so long people stopped remembering what was in them, about a ledger that had supposedly been given to a church official for safekeeping. She thought about the one place in any community that kept records as a matter of faith, not law, and was therefore never audited, never contested, never subpoenaed. She folded the letter. She blew out the lantern. She lay back in the dark. The church, she thought. Not the archive, not the registry. The church itself, the foundation, the back room, the space that held the oldest things, the things that predated the current record system, the things that no one had checked in years because everyone assumed they already knew what was there. She would need to get into the church. She would need to do it without anyone watching. And she would need to do it before the review hearing in 12 days. She was still thinking when the first light came gray over the mountains, and somewhere below she heard Garrett Calloway's boots on the kitchen floor, quiet and early, moving with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who had no idea that the woman sleeping 2 floors above him had just figured out where a dead man's evidence had been hidden for 15 years. She told him at breakfast. Not all of it. Not her father's letter. Not what Mrs. Bryn had said. Not the full reconstruction she had made in the dark. She told him the part he needed to know. "There may be a ledger," she said. "A Church Relief Fund record from 1869. If it exists, and if it's what I think it is, it would show Crowley redirecting widow fund payments. It would also show the same falsification method he used on your survey defect." Garrett was holding his coffee mug. He had not moved since she started talking. "Where?" he said. "The church. Old storage, if I'm right. The space no one checks." "How do you know this?" She looked at him. My father found it first, before he died. The silence was complete. Even Mrs. Bryn, who had come in from the pantry, stopped moving. Garrett set down his coffee mug. He looked at Clara with an expression that was too complicated to read all at once, something with grief in it, and anger, and something else she didn't try to name. "Your father was James Whitfield," he said. "Yes." "Crowley ruined him." "Yes." "You knew that when you came here." "Yes." His jaw was tight. "Did you come here for the ledger or for the debt relief?" It was a fair question. She answered it straight. "Both. I didn't know if the ledger was here until I read your father's, until I read your water law volume. I came for my brothers first. But yes, both." He looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that was making decisions. "All right," he said. "All right what?" Clara asked. "All right, we find it." He stood up. "How do we get into the church storage without Crowley's people noticing?" Clara blinked. She had prepared for several responses to this conversation. She had not prepared for immediate, unqualified agreement. "You're not going to ask me why I didn't tell you this before," she said. "You told me when you were ready," he said. "That's your right." He picked up his hat. "Mrs. Bryn, do you still have a key to the church back room?" Mrs. Bryn from the pantry doorway said, "I've had it for 20 years. Nobody ever asked for it." "I'm asking now," Garrett said. Mrs. Bryn went to the pantry. Clara heard a drawer, then the sound of an old key on a ring. She came back and set it on the table. Garrett picked it up and looked at Clara. "Tonight," he said. "After dark. Less movement in town." Clara looked at the key on the table. Then she looked at him. "You believe me," she said. Not a question exactly. Something closer to a recognition. "Yes," he said. "Why?" Garrett Calloway picked up his hat and set it on his head. He looked at her with those eyes that had been carefully withholding judgment since the day she arrived, and for the first time she saw clearly what he had been holding back. "Because Crowley took someone from me too," he said. "A long time ago. And I've been trying to prove it for 6 years." He walked out. The door closed. Clara sat at the breakfast table in the summer morning light with an old church key and a dead man's mission and the strange, unsettling feeling that she had arrived in Harlan Ridge, thinking she was walking into someone else's story, and had just discovered that she had been part of this one all along. The day moved slowly and suspensefully, the way days do when something important is scheduled for the dark end of them. Clara spent it carefully. She went to the dry goods store in town with Mrs. Bryn, which was a practical errand and also an opportunity to walk the distance between the ranch and the church, and note which buildings had views of the back entrance. She bought thread and sugar and acted like a woman doing household shopping and nothing else. At the dry goods counter, Mrs. Vance said with the brightness of someone who considers information to be currency, "Mr. Crowley stopped by this morning. He said he was very pleased to hear about the Calloway arrangement. Very pleased." Clara paid for her thread. "How kind of him." "He said he'd be calling on you both soon, to offer his congratulations." "We'll look forward to it," Clara said in the same tone she used for everything she did not intend to allow. Mrs. Vance looked at her oddly. Clara picked up her parcel and left. Outside, Mrs. Bryn caught up to her. "He knows," Mrs. Bryn said quietly. "I know he knows," Clara said. "He knew the moment Alcott filed the contract. The joint property clause was in there specifically to create a complication for him." She paused. "He'll try to move before the review hearing." "How?" "I don't know yet, but men like Crowley don't wait. They apply pressure until something gives." She looked at the church at the end of the street. "Which means we don't have 12 days. We have less." That afternoon, Pete came back from the north pasture with a message. Someone had cut 2 sections of Garrett's fence line on the property adjoining the creek bed. Not randomly. Precisely at the 2 points where the fence markers corresponded to the disputed survey boundaries. It was a provocation designed to look like vandalism. Garrett looked at the message and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Pete, You didn't see which direction they came from. No, sir. Already gone when I got there. All right, fix the sections. Don't talk about it in town. Pete nodded and went. Garrett looked at Clara. He's accelerating. I know, she said. If he thinks the joint property clause creates a complication, he'll try to remove one of the two claimants. Clara met his eyes. He can't contest me out of the contract without a legal process that would take longer than the review hearing. No, Garrett said. But he can make the marriage look fraudulent. If he can prove it was entered under false pretenses, that you came here already knowing about the water dispute, then the joint property clause collapses, Clara said. They looked at each other. Does anyone in town know why you really came? He asked. No one but Mrs. Bryn. And she's known for years and done nothing with it. Alcott. Alcott brokered the contract. He's Crowley's man or he's nobody's. I haven't decided which. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. We need the ledger tonight, not because we have time, because we don't. I know, Clara said. I've known since breakfast. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the summer day was pressing its heat against the house walls, and somewhere in the territory, a review clock was ticking down, and a man who had ruined her father and stolen from widows and cut fence lines in the dark was watching them from a comfortable distance and waiting for something to give. Clara Whitfield was not going to give him anything. She straightened. Tonight, she said. After dark. Bring the key. Garrett nodded once, and the long summer afternoon unfolded around them, full of heat and waiting and the specific tension of two people who have agreed to do something dangerous and must now simply survive the hours until they can do it. They left after 10 o'clock. Mrs. Bryn had gone to bed at 9, or had appeared, to which Clara suspected was Mrs. Bryn's way of providing them deniability without having to lie about it. Pete had ridden to a neighbor's property for the night on some errand Garrett had manufactured that afternoon with the practiced ease of a man who understood how to move pieces without explaining the board. The town was quiet. Not silent, the saloon still had light and noise at that hour, but the kind of quiet that settled over the residential streets and the church end of town like a second dusk. Clara wore dark clothing. Garrett wore what he always wore, which was dark enough by default. They did not speak on the walk in. They had said everything they needed to say at supper, in short, careful exchanges that communicated the plan without naming it, the kind of conversation that two people only manage when they have learned each other's rhythms well enough to work in the gaps. The church back entrance was off a narrow alley between the building and the property line of the house next door. Garrett tried the key in the lock. It resisted for a moment, old lock, old key, nothing used in years, and then turned with a sound that seemed very loud in the dark alley and was probably not audible 6 feet away. The door swung inward. Clara went first. The storage room was deep and dry and smelled of old wood and beeswax, and the particular stillness of spaces that haven't been disturbed in a long time. Garrett pulled the door mostly closed behind them. Clara lit the small shielded lantern she had brought low light, directed the kind that wouldn't show under a door, and held it up. Shelves along 2 walls, hymnal boxes stacked in the back corner. A trunk she recognized immediately as the kind used for registry storage in church administration, iron-banded old enough that the metal had oxidized to near black. She went straight to the trunk. The latch was not locked. She lifted the lid. Paper. Dozens of folded and bound documents, some clearly recent, some old enough that the edges had gone soft with age. She lifted the lantern and began to read the dates on the outer folds, moving quickly, efficiently, the way her father had taught her. You don't read everything, you read the dates first, and the titles second, and the contents only when the first 2 tell you you're in the right place. Anything, Garrett said behind her. Looking. 1867, 71, 64, and 82. Then tucked behind a bundle of hymnal inventory records, dated from the late 70s, a ledger. Brown cover, spine cracked. No title on the front. She opened it to the first page. Harlan Ridge, Community Relief Fund. Account record. Beginning January 1869. Clara's hands went very still. I found it, she said. She did not read it there. She was not a woman who read when she needed to move. She tucked the ledger inside her coat, closed the trunk, and straightened. "We need to go," she said. "Did you look at it?" "Enough." She had looked at 4 pages. 4 pages was enough to know that the ledger contained what she had believed it would contain: a record of relief fund disbursements that did not match the official accounting. Names, dates, amounts. Not falsified amounts, the amounts were correct. But the recipient columns had been altered. Not all of them, not clumsily. Selectively, the way someone alters records when they are very careful and believe no one with the right knowledge will ever look. Her father had the right knowledge. He had looked. Garrett held the door. Clara went through. He locked it behind them. They moved back through the alley, and Clara did not breathe properly until they were 2 streets away from the church, and the town noise from the saloon was audible again, which meant they were in the ordinary world and not in the specific danger of the alley. Then she breathed. "You're shaking," Garrett said. "I'm not," she said. She was slightly, but it was adrenaline, not fear, and there was a difference, and she resented the observation, even as she understood it was not unkind. "All right," he said. He didn't say it like he believed her. He said it like he was giving her the courtesy of the claim. They walked back to the ranch. Clara kept one hand pressed against her coat where the ledger was. She thought about her father writing in his final letter about the place no one checks anymore. She thought about him hiding the ledger there himself, or directing someone to hide it, or knowing that it would be safe there because no one who wanted to suppress it would think to look in a church trunk that hadn't been opened in years. She thought about what he had gone through, accused in open meeting, called a thief by men who had read his records and decided he was more dangerous than useful, dying with the proof of his innocence sitting in a dusty trunk 2 territories away from where he spent his last years. She pressed her hand harder against her coat. At the kitchen table by lantern light with Mrs. Bryn's coffee and Garrett sitting across from her without speaking, Clara read the ledger carefully for the first time. It took 2 hours. Garrett did not rush her. He refilled her coffee once. He sat with his hands flat on the table and waited, which was one of the more useful things a person could do, and also one of the most difficult, and she noted it without saying anything. The ledger was more complete than she had hoped and more damning than she had expected. The Harlan Ridge Community Relief Fund had disbursed between January and December of 1869 a total of $412 to widows and displaced ranch families across the territory. The ledger showed every disbursement. It showed the names of the recipients, the amounts, the dates, and the signatures of the fund administrators who authorized each payment. What it also showed in a second column in different ink in a hand, she recognized as her father's precise, careful notation, was what those disbursements had actually been, because someone had altered the recipient names on 37 of the entries. Not the amounts, not the dates, just the names. The altered entries showed payments going to legitimate widows. Her father's notations in the margins showed the actual disbursements going to a land brokerage account held in the name of a company called Harlan Ridge Cattle Concern. Not Crowley's name, his company's name. One step removed. Careful. But in the back of the ledger, in what appeared to be a notes section, her father had added, himself. There was something else. 3 pages of his handwriting, dense and precise, documenting the connection between the company account and Silas Crowley personally. Property records. A deed transfer. A bank correspondent letter with Crowley's signature. Her father had not just found the ledger. He had built the case around it. Clara looked up from the last page. Garrett was watching her. "He knew everything," she said. "My father. He had all of it. The ledger, the company connection, the deed transfers." Her voice was doing something she didn't fully control. She stopped and steadied it. He had enough to destroy Crowley, and Crowley destroyed him first. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's in the back section?" "My father's documentation, the connection between the company account and Crowley personally." She turned the ledger so he could see the pages. "It's dated 3 months before my father died." Garrett looked at the pages. His jaw was very tight. He was building evidence, and Crowley knew. Yes. So Crowley moved first. The theft accusation. Yes. In public. In open meeting. Once your name is ruined publicly in a small community, the evidence you hold becomes suspect. Who believes a thief's ledger? Nobody, Garrett said. He said it like it tasted bad. They believed Crowley because it was easier. People usually do, Clara said. Garrett looked at the ledger for a long time. Then he looked at her. Your brother's debt, he said quietly. Clara stilled. Daniel's loan, he said. Who held the original debt paper? Crowley, she said. Through a broker. But Crowley. When did your brother take that loan? She knew the date. She had memorized it from the debt letter. 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Daniel was 20. Why did a 20-year-old farm boy need $460 in? Clara opened her mouth, closed it. She thought about Daniel's letter, his cramped, anxious handwriting, his apology for asking her to be strong again. She had never asked him to explain the debt in detail. She had focused on the number and the solution and not the origin. He needed to save the property, she said slowly. After my father died, the land taxes were... She stopped. Were they? Garrett said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And in the space between them, something terrible and very clear arrived. Crowley knew my father had the ledger, Clara said. My father died and didn't tell anyone where it was, but Crowley couldn't be certain the evidence was gone. He needed to make sure no one from that family could ever afford a lawyer or a land survey or the time and resources to go looking. So he created a debt, Garrett said, and held it, Clara said, for 3 years, until it was large enough that the only way out was... She stopped. Was you? Garrett said. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Clara looked at the ledger in her hands. She thought about Alcott's careful cheerfulness. She thought about Crowley telling Mrs. Vance he was very pleased about the Calloway arrangement. She thought about the joint property clause and the ink that didn't match and a marriage contract that had appeared precisely when it was most needed. He sent me here, she said. It came out flat and quiet. He manufactured Daniel's debt large enough to force a marriage arrangement. Then he presented the Calloway contract, knowing I would have enough of my father's skill to find the ledger if I looked, and knowing that if I found it, he could then claim the marriage was fraudulent, entered under false pretenses for the purpose of accessing evidence in an ongoing legal dispute, and use that to collapse the joint property clause and leave your spring claim unprotected. And take the ledger in the process, Garrett said, as evidence of fraud, meaning it never reaches a court. They looked at each other across the table. It's a trap, Clara said. It's a trap, Garrett said. Neither of them slept that night. They sat at the kitchen table until the lantern needed refilling, and then kept sitting in the dimmer light, talking through the pieces, the way you talk through something when you know the shape of it, but not yet the way out. Clara made notes in the blank ledger book she had brought from Millbrook. Garrett talked. She wrote. Occasionally she asked a question, and he thought about it and answered carefully, and occasionally she said something, and he disagreed, and they argued it out in short direct exchanges that neither of them softened or performed. She had never had a conversation like that, with someone who pushed back, who didn't manage her. She noticed it and put it aside. By 3 a.m, they had a clear picture of what Crowley had done, and a partial picture of what could be done about it. The ledger was evidence, but evidence needed a venue. The review hearing in 12 days was a land dispute proceeding, not a fraud case. They needed a separate filing. Territorial court, Clara said. Fraud and misappropriation of relief funds. We can file a separate petition that would run concurrent with the review hearing. That takes a lawyer, Garrett said. Not Alcott. No, there's a man in the county seat, Donahue. He's not Crowley's. He's no one's, which means he costs more. How much time to reach him? A day-and-a-half ride. You'd need to leave tomorrow. Today. She corrected herself. It was already past midnight. Garrett looked at her. You'd be here alone. Mrs. Bryn is here. Crowley's going to hear I'm gone within hours of me leaving. He'll send someone. I know that, Clara said. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to ride to the county seat and file a concurrent petition with a man who isn't Crowley's before the review hearing. And if he comes to the house while I'm gone," Clara looked at him, "then I'll handle it." He looked back at her for a long moment. His expression was doing that complicated thing again, the one with several things moving behind it at once. "You have a plan for that," he said. "I have the beginning of one," she said. "I need tonight to finish it." Garrett stood up. He looked at the ledger on the table between them. Then he looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened the way a door opens when someone finally decides they trust what's on the other side. "Your father would have liked this," he said quietly. Clara looked down at the ledger. Her chest did something she didn't have the resources to manage right now. "Go to bed," she said. "You need to leave at first light." He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "Clara?" It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Whitfield. Clara. She looked up. "Don't open the door for anyone you don't know," he said. "I know that," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." He went upstairs. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the ledger and her notebook and the quiet house around her, and she let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of what had been done to her family. Her father's lonely, careful work, his ruined name, Daniel's manufactured debt, the years of it. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. And Garrett rode out before 5. He stopped at the back door long enough to say, 3 days. Maybe less if Donahue is already at his office and not in court. "I'll be here," Clara said. He looked at her once that same held-back look. Then he was gone, and the sound of his horse diminished toward the mountain road, and the morning was very quiet. Mrs. Bryn came downstairs at 5:30 and found Clara at the kitchen table, with 2 cups of coffee already poured. "He's gone," Mrs. Bryn said. "Yes." Mrs. Bryn sat down and picked up her coffee. "And Crowley will know by noon." "By noon," Clara agreed. Mrs. Bryn looked at her over the rim of her cup. "What are we doing?" Clara showed her the plan she had written in the night. Mrs. Bryn read it. She read it again. Then she set it down and looked at Clara with an expression that Clara had seen before on her mother's face, on the faces of women who had been underestimated for so long, that recognizing genuine capability in another woman felt like something close to relief. "Your father's daughter," Mrs. Bryn said. "Yes," Clara said. And this time she didn't try to manage what her chest did when she heard it. Crowley came himself. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected a man, a representative, someone with a legal document or a veiled threat wrapped in social courtesy. She had not expected Silas Crowley in person at 3 in the afternoon, arriving at the front gate in a good suit, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had a door closed on him. He was not what she had pictured. She had built a picture of the man who had destroyed her father, and it had been large and loud, something she could recognize as a threat from a distance. Crowley was compact, well-dressed, with a pleasant face and mild eyes, and the particular manner of a man who has learned that people are less guarded around pleasantness than around menace. She watched him from the window for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it before he knocked. He stopped, smiled. "Mrs. Calloway, or Miss Whitfield, is it? I understand you prefer that." "Mr. Crowley," she said. "I know who you are." "Of course you do." He smiled like she had said something charming. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "You're calling at the time you calculated would be most effective," she said. "Please come in." He blinked. Just slightly. A man who expected to control the entrance and had been given it too quickly, which made him uncertain about what he was walking into. Good, she thought. She brought him to the front room and did not offer coffee. She sat. He sat. He looked around the room with the eyes of a man taking inventory. "Mr. Calloway is away," she said. "I heard," he said. "Business." "Personal," she said. "Of course." He crossed one leg over the other, relaxed, performing ease. I wanted to come and offer my congratulations in person. The arrangement surprised many of us in town. Garrett has always been private." "He is," Clara said. "It's one of the things I respect about him." "How did you two meet, if you don't mind my asking?" "Through a mutual legal arrangement," she said, "which I believe you know quite well." The pleasantness on his face didn't disappear. It adjusted. "I helped facilitate the connection, yes. I thought it might benefit both parties." "How generous of you," Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back. She was working very hard to keep her face pleasant and open and entirely unreadable, and she believed she was succeeding because her father had taught her that too. "Miss Whitfield," Crowley said, and the pleasantness dropped one layer, just one enough to signal that he was choosing to be direct. "I'll be honest with you. I'm a little concerned about the water rights situation with the North Ridge claim. I have a petition before the review board, and I want everyone's interests to be protected properly, including yours." "My interests are protected by the marriage contract," she said. "The joint property clause." He nodded. "Yes, a clever addition. I was surprised to see it." He paused. "I wonder if you understood what you were signing when you agreed to it." "I understand legal documents very well," she said. "My father was a record keeper." Something moved behind his eyes. Fast controlled, but there. "Yes," he said. "I believe I knew your father, briefly. Sad situation." "Very," Clara said. "He was a thorough man. He kept excellent records." The room was very quiet. "Miss Whitfield," Crowley said, "I'm going to be direct with you. The petition I've filed is solid. The survey defect is a matter of record. The review board will find in my favor, and when they do, the North Ridge Spring claim will be in dispute. At that point, a joint property clause doesn't create a second claimant, it creates a second liability. I would strongly encourage you to speak with Mr. Calloway about reaching a reasonable settlement before the hearing." "And if I don't?" she said. He looked at her with those mild eyes. "Then the process moves forward, and these things have a way of becoming very complicated, especially when questions arise about the circumstances under which a marriage was contracted." "Are you threatening to challenge my marriage?" Clara said. "I'm expressing concern," he said. "That's all." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Mr. Crowley, I want to tell you something." He waited. "My father found your ledger," she said. The pleasantness on his face did not disappear, but underneath it, something changed. Something went cold and very, very still. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "The Harlan Ridge Community Relief Fund ledger from 1869, she said, with the recipient columns altered on 37 entries, and my father's notations in the margins connecting the company account to you personally." Crowley stood up. "Sit down, Mr. Crowley," Clara said. He did not sit down. He looked at her with those mild eyes, and behind them, the pleasantness was gone entirely. And what was there instead was the face of someone calculating. "Where is it?" he said. "Safe," she said. "That ledger is evidence," she said, "of fraud and misappropriation of relief funds. And I believe if the territorial court examines it carefully, evidence of the same falsification method used on the survey document you submitted in your current petition. You cannot prove—" "My father already proved it," Clara said. "I'm just delivering his work." He left 12 minutes later. He did not threaten her directly. Men like Crowley did not make direct threats in front of witnesses, and Mrs. Bryn had been in the kitchen the entire conversation, close enough to hear every word. Clara stood at the window and watched him ride away. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them flat against her sides. Mrs. Bryn appeared in the doorway. "You told him you have it." "Yes." "Now he knows. He already knew we found it. He built this whole arrangement so that we would find it and he could take it. I just needed him to know that we know that." Mrs. Bryn frowned. "Why?" "Because now he has to move," Clara said. "He can't wait. He'll come for the ledger tonight or tomorrow, before Garrett gets back, before a concurrent petition can be filed. And when he does, Clara turned from the window, he'll find that the ledger isn't here. Mrs. Bryn stared at her. Where is it? By the time Crowley comes back, it will be in the hands of every woman on those 4 properties whose relief payments were redirected, Clara said. Every widow whose name appears in that ledger altered. They're going to read it. They're going to remember. And when the time comes, they're going to say in open court what they know. You can't get to 4 properties by tonight. I can't, Clara said. But you can. You know those women. They know you. She looked at Mrs. Bryn. I made copies last night of the most critical pages. My father's notation section. 3 copies. They go to 3 people tonight who are not connected to this ranch and not connected to Alcott. Mrs. Bryn was very still. Then she said slowly, You planned this before he even came. I planned for the possibility, Clara said. He confirmed it. And the original ledger stays here, Clara said, locked, in the most obvious place in the house because obvious is the one place no one looks twice. She paused. I'll put it back in Garrett's territorial law volume, section 44, right where I found the first information I needed. Mrs. Bryn looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something Clara had not seen her do once since arriving at the Calloway Ranch. She laughed. Short, low, genuine. The laugh of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something to break the right way. Get the copies, Mrs. Bryn said. I'll have the horse ready in 20 minutes. Crowley's man came at midnight. Clara heard him on the porch not trying to be quiet, which was the point which meant Crowley wanted her scared rather than robbed. She sat at the kitchen table with the lantern low and the territorial law volume within arm's reach and did not go to the door. The man knocked. Hard. Miss Whitfield. The voice was flat and without inflection. Mr. Crowley needs to speak with you. Mr. Crowley can come himself in daylight, Clara said through the door. A pause. He's asked me to collect some documents. There are no documents here belonging to Mr. Crowley, Clara said. Another pause. She heard him move on the porch, testing the door maybe, deciding. Then she heard a second sound. A horse in the yard. More than one. Her heart lurched. Then she heard Pete's voice from the yard. Something I can help you with. And behind Pete, another voice she didn't expect. Lower, tired from riding, but unmistakable. Garrett. She heard him say, Get off my porch. The man on the porch said nothing. She heard his boots on the steps retreating. She heard a horse move, then 2 horses going away down the road. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface for a full 30 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Garrett was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked like a man who had ridden hard for 2 days in the wrong direction, which was exactly what he was. Dusty, tired hat pushed back slightly. I thought you were going to the county seat, she said. I was, he said. I got to the first way station and turned around. She stared at him. Why? He looked at her. Because I left you here alone and told myself you could handle it, and got 12 miles down the road before I decided I didn't want to find out what handle it meant in the middle of the night. Clara looked at him, standing in the yard, in the dark, dusty, and tired, and there, when she hadn't expected him, and something happened in her chest that she did not try to manage or put aside. The petition, she said. Pete can ride, he said. He knows Donahue. He'll go at first light with a letter from me. He paused. Did you get the ledger out? Mrs. Bryn has copies at 3 properties. The original is in your law volume. He absorbed this. You did that today. Yes. While he was here. After he left, she said. While he thought I was sitting here frightened. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. The yard was quiet. The summer night pressed close and warm around them. You weren't frightened, he said. I was, she said. Because that was the truth, and she was done pretending otherwise in front of this man. I was frightened the whole time. That's not the same as stopped. He looked at her with that open expression, the one that had appeared at the kitchen table the night before, and had not quite closed back up since. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." He came up the steps. She stepped back to let him through the door. He stopped in the doorway very close in the narrow space, and she could see how tired he was, and how much he was not saying. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back." He looked at her. "Thank your father," he said, "for raising someone worth coming back for." He went inside. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment in the summer night, her hand on the doorframe. Her heart doing something she had stopped trying to name 2 days ago. Then she followed him in, and the door closed, and the dark outside was just the dark, and the ledger sat safe in section 44, and somewhere in the territory, Mrs. Bryn was riding with the truth toward the women who had been waiting 15 years for someone to bring it to them. Pete rode out before sunrise. Garrett had written the letter to Donahue by lamplight, while Clara sat across the table and checked every word for legal precision, the way her father had taught her, the way she had not done for anyone else since her father died. She corrected 2 phrases. Garrett did not object. He crossed them out and wrote her versions without comment. And that small thing, the uncomplicated acceptance of her correction, stayed with her longer than she expected it to. Pete took the letter and 2 copies of the ledger's most critical pages and rode hard for the county seat. Garrett watched him go from the yard. 3 days, he said. Maybe 2.5 if the road's clear. The review hearing is in 9 days, Clara said. I know. That's enough time for Donahue to file the concurrent petition and for the board to receive notice before they convene. Barely. Barely is enough, she said. Garrett turned and looked at her. He had slept 4 hours after riding back through the night, and he looked like it, and she suspected she looked similar, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing useful in saying it. Crowley's going to move today, Garrett said. He came last night and got nothing. He's not going to wait. No, Clara said. He's going to do what he always does. He's going to go public. He did it at the dry goods store. By 8 in the morning, before Clara had finished her second cup of coffee, Mrs. Vance's daughter appeared at the gate, 17, breathless, with the wide eyes of someone who had been sent on an errand she didn't fully understand, but knew was urgent. Mrs. Vance says you should know, the girl said. Mr. Crowley is at the store. He's talking. Clara set down her coffee cup. What is he saying? The girl hesitated. That the marriage isn't that you came here with a purpose. That it wasn't a real... She stopped, looked uncomfortable. He said you came to steal Mr. Calloway's water rights. Clara looked at the girl for a moment. Thank you, she said. Tell your mother I appreciate it. The girl left. Clara went inside to find Garrett. He was in the front room. He had heard. He's faster than I expected, Clara said. He's scared, Garrett said. Scared men move fast. Scared men also move badly, she said. He's making the accusation in public before he has the ledger. That means he's trying to shape the story before we can. Can he? Clara thought about this. She thought about the church women and Mrs. Vance's kitchen currency and the way information moved through a small town. Not like water, which found the lowest point, but like fire, which moved toward whatever was driest. He can start it, she said. He can't finish it, not with what the ledger says. The town doesn't know about the ledger, Garrett said. They will, Clara said. By tonight, if Mrs. Bryn reaches the women on those 4 properties, at least 3 families will have read copies of those pages. Those families have neighbors. Neighbors talk. She paused. Crowley's trying to make the story about me. I need the story to be about the money. How? She looked at him. The church relief auction is in 3 days, the summer collection. Mrs. Bryn told me about it last week. Garrett stared at her. You want to go to the auction? I want to go to the auction, and I want every widow on those 4 properties to be there, she said. And I want the ledger. Clara. He's going to call me a fraud in public, she said. I would rather he do it when I can answer. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe, and landed somewhere between the two. "You're going to read the ledger out loud," he said. "Not the whole thing," she said. "Enough. In front of the whole town." "In front of the whole town," she said. "Including the women whose names were altered. They deserve to hear it. And the town deserves to hear it. And Crowley deserves to hear his own work read back to him in public." Garrett was quiet for a long time. "He'll try to stop you," he said. "Yes," she said. "He might have men there." "Probably," she said. "And you still want to do this?" She looked at him steadily. "My father tried to do this quietly. He built the case carefully and privately, and he died before he could finish it. I am not going to be quiet about this. Not anymore." Garrett held her gaze. Then he put on his hat. "I'm going to town," he said. "I'm going to talk to every man on those 4 properties myself, personally." Clara blinked. "That's not necessary. The women have the copies," he said. "I'm talking to the men because Crowley is going to bring men to that auction, and I am not standing next to you in front of the whole town without knowing who's standing next to me." He paused at the door. "I'll be back by supper." He left. Clara stood in the front room with the territorial law volume on the desk and the summer morning pressing through the window, and the understanding arriving now, with a quiet force that surprised her, that she had not once in 3 days felt alone in this house. She filed that away in the place where she kept things that required more thought before they could be properly understood. Then she sat down and began preparing what she was going to say. Mrs. Bryn came back by noon. She rode in tired and dusty and went straight to the kitchen for water, and Clara followed and waited until she had drunk and sat down before asking. "All 3, Clara said. "All 3, Mrs. Bryn said. "Took half the night, but they read it, every one of them." "How did they react?" Mrs. Bryn set down her cup. She looked at Clara with an expression that was difficult to read. Complicated, layered the face of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just watched someone else pick up part of it. "Margaret Sills cried," she said. "Her husband's homestead was on that list. She knew the payment was short. She thought she'd miscounted. She's been thinking that for 15 years. She paused. Ellen Drum didn't say anything. She just read the whole thing twice, and then she looked at me and said, "Is this enough to hold up in court?" And when I said I believed it was, she said, "Then I'll be at the auction." Clara's chest was tight. "And the third, Frances Neal." Mrs. Bryn was quiet for a moment. "Frances lost her property the year after her payment was shorted. She couldn't make the tax without the full relief amount. She's been living in her daughter's house since 1871. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, 'Tell the young woman thank you.'" Clara looked at the wall. She breathed carefully. "They'll come to the auction," Mrs. Bryn said, "and they'll talk to their neighbors between now and then. By the day of the auction, I think most of the families on those 4 properties will know what the ledger says." "Good," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "Clara." Mrs. Bryn rarely used her name. When she did, it meant something. "Crowley knows what you have. He's going to try to take it before the auction." "I know. Not at midnight this time. In daylight. Legally if he can." "He can't," Clara said. "The ledger belongs to the church. It was found in church storage. It is a church record. He has no legal standing to demand its return." "He'll find standing." "Let him look," Clara said. "We have 9 days and a concurrent petition writing to the county seat. He doesn't have time to manufacture standing that would hold." Mrs. Bryn looked at her. "You're very certain." "I'm not certain at all," Clara said honestly. "I'm moving as if I am, because the alternative is to stop moving, and I don't know how to do that." Mrs. Bryn looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up, took her cup to the basin, and said, "I'll start supper. Garrett will be hungry when he gets back." Biot. The days between that morning and the auction moved the way storm days move, charged, compressed each hour, holding more in it than it should. Crowley made 2 more attempts. The first was legal, a letter from Alcott's office requesting the return of what was described as misplaced church property, currently believed to be in the possession of persons on the Callaway Ranch. Garrett read it, handed it to Clara, and Clara wrote a response in 3 sentences, stating that any church property found in church storage remained under church jurisdiction and would be made available for review by the church board, not by private legal representatives. She signed it. Garrett signed it, and they sent it back with Pete. Alcott did not respond. The second attempt was social. Mrs. Alcott came to the house alone this time, without Mrs. Vance or Helen Marsh, and sat across from Clara in the front room and said with the careful control of a woman who was genuinely frightened, "Please be careful at the auction. He doesn't manage being outmaneuvered well." Clara looked at her. "Mrs. Alcott, does your husband know what's in that ledger?" Mrs. Alcott's face went through 3 expressions in quick succession. "He brokered a contract," she said carefully. He doesn't know the details of—" "Did he know Crowley manufactured Daniel's debt?" Clara said. The silence was its own answer. Mrs. Alcott looked at her hands. "My husband is not a bad man," she said. "He made choices that he was afraid. Crowley has holdings in half the properties in this territory. When a man like that tells a lawyer in a small town what the arrangement is, you either accept it or you leave," Clara said quietly. "Yes," Mrs. Alcott said. "I understand that," Clara said. "I'm not here to destroy your husband. I'm here to establish a record. The record will include what it includes. I don't control that." Mrs. Alcott looked at her. Her eyes were bright. "Is there anything I can do?" Clara thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Come to the auction." "I always come to the auction." "Come and stand in the front," Clara said. "Just stand there. That's enough." Mrs. Alcott left without her coffee. Tiong. The night before the auction, Garrett found Clara on the porch. She had been sitting there for an hour long enough for the summer dark to settle completely and the stars to come out over the mountain line. She heard him come through the door and did not turn around. He sat in the other chair, the one he usually sat in. She noticed that they had established without discussion which chair belonged to whom, and she noticed she found that comfortable rather than alarming, and she let herself notice it without immediately rationalizing it away. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm going." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to read it yourself. I know that." "I could—" "No," she said. It came out more firmly than she intended. She moderated her voice. "It has to be me. My father built that case. I'm the one who carries his name. When those names are read out loud in front of that town, it has to come from someone who understands what it costs to find them." She paused. "And I want Crowley to look at my face when I do it." Garrett said nothing for a while. The night moved around them. "My sister's name," he said finally. "Is it in there?" Clara had been waiting for this question since she read the ledger fully. She had not brought it up because she did not know how he would need to receive it. "Yes," she said quietly. She was on the relief fund list. "Yes, the payment to her name was redirected." She kept her voice level and careful. "The same year she lost the homestead." Garrett was very still. "If the full payment had come through," Clara said, "she would have been able to make the land tax by $40. The number sat between them like a stone. $40, he said. His voice was flat in the particular way of someone keeping something very large, very tightly controlled. "Yes. Crowley shorted her by $40 and she lost the homestead and she—" He stopped. "Yes," Clara said. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The mountain dark was complete around them. Clara listened to Garrett breathe, steadying himself, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would make a $40 gap in a dead woman's payment feel like anything other than what it was. Finally, he said, "Read her name first." Clara looked at him. "Garrett?" "When you read the names," he said, "read hers first." "All right," she said. "I will." He nodded once. He stood up. He went inside without another word. Clara sat on the porch a while longer, the ledger in her lap, her father's handwriting under her fingers in the dark, and thought about all the people who had paid the price of one man's careful, pleasant cruelty, and let herself be angry completely and without management for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Ridge. Then she went inside. She slept 4 hours. She got up and dressed and was ready before the sun. The church hall was full by 9 in the morning. This was not unusual for the summer relief auction. It was the largest community gathering of the season, and people came from the outlying properties and the neighboring ranches and the farms along the creek bed, because it was also practically speaking a social occasion, and social occasions in the territory were scarce enough that people did not miss them. But Clara, standing near the back with Mrs. Bryn and the ledger in her satchel, could see that today's attendance was different. Not the usual comfortable scatter of neighbors who knew each other. Tighter groups. Women she didn't know standing together with the particular posture of people who have spoken recently and arrived with a shared purpose. Men from the outlying properties who had ridden further than usual for a summer auction. She saw Margaret Sills near the east wall, standing with 2 women Clara didn't recognize, and one she did, Ellen Drum, compact and straight-backed with the stillness of someone who has decided what she is there to do. She saw Frances Neal near the front, small, older, wearing her good dress. She looked at Clara when Clara came in. She nodded once, a small decided movement, the nod of a woman who has waited 15 years for this morning. Clara nodded back. She did not see Crowley. "He's here," Garrett said quietly from beside her. He had come in behind her, and she had not heard him, which said something about how focused she was. "Far corner. 2 men with him." She did not look. "Alcott?" "No, Alcott isn't here." That was interesting. "Crowley told him to stay away." "Probably," Garrett said. "Means he doesn't expect this to go well for Alcott if it goes badly for him." She looked at the front of the hall where Reverend Hayes was organizing the auction table with the helpful incompetence of a man who was better at sermons than logistics. She caught his eye, and he came to her with the anxious expression he had been wearing since she had spoken to him yesterday afternoon. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I've given you the floor after the opening prayer as we discussed, but I want you to understand." "Reverend Hayes," she said, "the ledger was found in your church storage. The money that was stolen was your church's relief fund. These are your congregation members." She looked at him. "You told me yesterday that you believed the evidence was real." "I do," he said unhappily. "Then give me the floor and stand next to me while I use it. That's all I'm asking." He straightened slightly. "Yes," he said. "All right." The morning prayer was longer than usual. Clara stood with the ledger in her hands and her eyes open and thought about nothing except the first sentence she was going to say. Then Reverend Hayes said, "Before we begin our auction, Miss Whitfield has asked permission to address the community on a matter of church record. I've granted that permission, and I ask that everyone extend her the courtesy of their attention." The room stirred. She heard Crowley's voice from the far corner, a low, sharp word she didn't catch. She walked to the front of the hall. She did not look at Crowley. She looked at the room. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said loud and clear and without preamble. "My father was James Whitfield, a land record keeper in the Eastern Territories. 15 years ago, he was accused of stealing from the Harlan Ridge Community Relief Fund. He was called a thief in open meeting. He died disgraced in debt, his name destroyed." She paused. "He was innocent, and I can prove it." The room was very quiet. She opened the ledger. "This is the Harlan Ridge Community Relief Fund account record from 1869, she said. "It was found in this church's own storage in a trunk in the back room, where it has been sitting for 15 years because someone put it there believing it would never be found." She heard a sound from the far corner. She kept her eyes on the room. "This ledger shows every disbursement made by the Relief Fund in 1869. It shows the names of the recipients, the amounts and the dates. And it shows in 37 entries that the recipient names were altered. The money did not go to the widows and families recorded on those entries. It went to a land brokerage account. I will read you the account name." She read it. The room stirred. Several people looked at the far corner. I will also read you the names of the women whose payments were redirected. These women or their families may be present in this room today. I am reading their names because they deserve to have them spoken correctly in public by someone who knows what was taken from them. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the first name on the page. She drew one breath. Sarah Calloway, she said. Payment redirected. Amount $40. Date August 1869. The room was silent enough that she could hear the summer wind on the walls. She kept reading. She got through 11 names before Crowley spoke. This is fabricated evidence. His voice came from the far corner sharp and carrying the voice of a man accustomed to filling rooms. That ledger was tampered with. The notations are false. This woman came to this town with a purpose, and I have documented proof. Mr. Crowley, Clara said not loudly, you are welcome to speak when I am finished. You're not going to be finished because this is... The ledger is a church record, Reverend Hayes said from beside her. Quietly, but with a firmness Clara had not been certain he possessed. Found in this church's storage. I have examined it. I am satisfied it is genuine. Then you're being deceived, Crowley said. He was moving through the room now, coming toward the front. His two men shifted behind him. This woman is her father was a thief who tried to falsify church records, and she's continuing his work. Sit down, Crowley. The voice came from the east wall. Margaret Sills. She said it the way you say something you have been waiting to say for 15 years and have finally run out of reasons not to. Crowley stopped. My husband's name is in that ledger, Margaret Sills said. Our payment was shorted. I knew it at the time and I couldn't prove it, and I've been thinking I was wrong for 15 years. Her voice broke on the last word, and she steadied it. I wasn't wrong. Mrs. Sills, Crowley started. My name is in that ledger, Ellen Drum said from across the room. Flat factual, impossible to argue with. And mine, said a voice Clara didn't recognize. Then another. Then a third. Crowley's face had gone through several expressions. The pleasantness was entirely gone. What was there now was something stripped and calculating, and underneath it, something that looked like a man watching the ground shift under his feet. His hand went to his coat. Garrett moved. He was across the room before Clara fully processed it, not fast in a showy way, but with the immediate certain movement of someone who has been watching for the specific moment, and recognized it the instant it arrived. He put himself between Clara and Crowley with a single step, and he said very quietly, Don't. Crowley's hand stopped. Whatever you're reaching for, Garrett said in that same quiet voice, put it away. There are 40 people in this room, and half of them have known you for a decade, and you just watched all of them decide something about you. You want to add to that decision? Go ahead. The room was absolutely still. Crowley's hand came away from his coat. Empty. He looked at Garrett with those stripped-back eyes, and then he looked at Clara, and something in his face did the last thing she expected. It collapsed. Not into remorse. Into the naked, unguarded expression of a man who has just understood that he has lost. This isn't over, he said. It is, Clara said. She said it quietly, and she meant it completely. The concurrent petition was filed with the Territorial Court 2 days ago. The review board will receive notice before the hearing. The ledger will be submitted as evidence in a fraud proceeding. She held his gaze. And my father's name will be cleared in the same court that disgraced him, publicly, on the record. Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the church hall. His two men followed. The door opened closed, and the summer light came through the gap for a moment, and then was gone. The room stayed quiet for 3 full seconds. Then someone Clara never knew who started to clap. Not enthusiastically, not the relieved performed applause of people celebrating a show. Slowly. The kind of sound a room makes when something is true and people are still adjusting to the weight of it. Frances Neal walked to the front. She was small, as Clara had noticed. and she moved carefully with the deliberate pace of someone who has learned not to rush toward things they might not get. She stopped in front of Clara and held out her hand. Clara took it. "Your father would be proud," Frances Neal said. Clara did not try to manage what her face did. She was tired of managing. "Thank you," she said. Frances Neal nodded. She held Clara's hand for a moment longer than necessary, and Clara let her, because sometimes what people need is not to be thanked, but to be permitted to give something. Then Frances went back to her seat, and Reverend Hayes said quietly, "Shall we continue with the auction?" And somehow improbably they did. Outside afterward in the summer heat, Garrett found her at the side of the hall. She was standing with her back against the wall and the ledger closed in her arms and her eyes shut, just breathing. She heard him come around the corner and did not open her eyes immediately. "It's done," he said. "The hearing is still in 6 days," she said, eyes still closed. "Donahue will handle the hearing. We have the ledger, the copies, and 3 women willing to testify." He paused. "It's done, Clara." She opened her eyes. He was standing in front of her hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she had stopped trying to fully decode because every time she got close to understanding it, it moved into something new. "Your sister's name," she said. He said. "I heard you say it." Was that all right?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It was right." His voice was not quite steady on the last word. He steadied it. She deserved to have her name said correctly. Clara looked at him. She thought about the $40. She thought about how long he had carried the particular grief of knowing that what happened to his sister was not accident or hardship, but theft, small and deliberate and hidden. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not as a formula. As a fact." "I know," he said. "As a fact." They stood in the summer heat outside the church hall and the town moved around them, and something between them that had been building since a morning in a lawyer's office when she had refused to sit down had arrived at a place that neither of them tried to name yet. "Come on," Garrett said. He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Bryn will have supper ready, and Pete should be back from the county seat by tonight." Clara fell into step beside him, and the summer afternoon carried them home through the dust and the heat and the particular quiet of a day that has changed things permanently. The kind of quiet that comes not from nothing, having happened, but from everything having finally landed in its right place. Pete came back from the county seat that evening with 2 things: a confirmation letter from Donahue's office and a look on his face that said he had ridden harder than he ever had in his life and was quietly proud of it. Garrett read the letter at the kitchen table while Clara stood behind his left shoulder and read it at the same time. Donahue had filed the concurrent fraud petition with the territorial court the morning Pete arrived. The review board had been formally notified. The hearing in 6 days would proceed with both matters on the record simultaneously, the water rights review and the fraud case running parallel, which meant that any ruling on the spring claim would have to account for the evidentiary weight of the ledger before it could be finalized. "He says the ledger is strong," Garrett said. "It is," Clara said. "He says your father's documentation section is—" Garrett paused, reading. "He says it's the most complete private evidence construction he's seen in 15 years of territorial law." Clara looked at the letter. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He was a thorough man." "Yes," Garrett said quietly. He was. Pete was eating at the far end of the table, with the focused dedication of someone who has not had a real meal in 2 days, and Mrs. Bryn was refilling his plate with the expression of a woman who shows care through feeding people and does not require it to be acknowledged. Clara folded the letter and set it on the table. "Crowley will know about the petition by tomorrow morning." "He already knew," Garrett said. "Donahue told Pete that Crowley has representation in the county seat. His man would have seen the filing. So he knows the hearing isn't just a water rights review anymore." "He knows," Garrett said. "Question is, what he does with that." Clara thought about Crowley walking out of the church hall. The way his face had looked in that final moment, not remorseful, not broken, but recalculating. A man like Crowley did not stop because a room of 40 people had turned against him. He adjusted. He found another angle. She had known that even as she watched him leave, and she had let herself feel the relief of the morning's events anyway, because relief and vigilance were not mutually exclusive, and she was learning slowly to let herself have both. "He'll try to discredit the petition," she said. "The ledger or the witness testimony or both. He'll argue my father's notations are forgeries." "Can he make that stick?" "In court with a good attorney, maybe for a while. Donahue will need comparison documents, other records in my father's handwriting from the same period." She paused. "Daniel has letters. My father wrote extensively during those years. If Daniel can send them." "Write to him tonight," Garrett said. "I'll have it on the mail stage tomorrow morning." She looked at him. He said it the same way he had said everything practical over the past days, without preamble, without making it into a gesture. Just the next necessary thing offered and ready. "All right," she said. She wrote the letter to Daniel that night. It was the longest letter she had written him in 2 years, longer than the one that said she was going longer than the careful progress notes she had sent to reassure him. She told him everything. Not managed, not measured for how much he could handle. Everything. What she had found, what it meant, what their father had done, what it was going to do to Crowley's case when the territorial court saw it. She told him their father was innocent, and she had proof. She did not cry while she wrote it. She cried after briefly, in the dark of her east-facing room, for the exact length of time it took to understand that she had been carrying the weight of her father's uncleared name for 3 years and had just put it down. Then she washed her face and went to sleep and slept for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember without waking once before morning. The 6 days before the hearing moved differently than the days before the auction. Those had been charged compressed dangerous, in a way that kept the body tense and the mind running. These were different deliberate procedural, the slower tension of a process that had been set in motion and now had to be trusted. Donahue rode in on the 3rd day. He was a small, precise man, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been in enough courtrooms to know that the person who appears most calm usually has the best case. He sat at the kitchen table with Clara and Garrett, and the ledger spread between them, and spent 2 hours asking questions Clara had already asked herself, and several she hadn't. "The comparison documents from your brother," he said. "How certain are you they'll arrive in time?" "The mail stage is reliable on that route," Clara said. "Daniel will have sent them the morning he received my letter. That gives us," she calculated, 3 days before the hearing. Enough. And the 3 women. "Margaret Sills, Ellen Drum, and Frances Neal," Clara said. "They've agreed to appear. Mrs. Bryn will bring them." "Mrs. Bryn is also a witness herself, I understand, to conversations with your father 15 years ago." "She is," Clara said. "She's prepared to say what she knows." Donahue nodded, making a note. "Crowley's attorney has submitted a preliminary motion arguing the ledger is inadmissible on the grounds that it was removed from church property without authorization." Clara looked at him. "On what basis?" "He's arguing you trespassed." "We used a key held by a church member in good standing," Garrett said. "Mrs. Bryn has held that key for 20 years. "I know," Donahue said. "The motion won't hold, but it tells us what Crowley's strategy is. He's not going to attack the ledger's content directly, he can't, because your father's documentation is too specific. He's going to attack the chain of custody. Try to get it excluded on procedural grounds before the board ever looks at what's in it." "Can he?" Clara said. "Not successfully," Donahue said, "but he'll try to slow it down. Create enough procedural noise that the review board grants a continuance on the fraud case while proceeding with the water rights review." "Separating them," Clara said. "Yes. If he can get the fraud case continued past the water rights hearing the board rules on the spring claim without the ledger evidence in the record, and he has a much better chance on the water rights." Clara looked at the ledger. She thought very carefully. "Then we need to ensure the board cannot grant a continuance without the fraud evidence being formally entered into the record first. Before the hearing convenes. Donahue looked at her with a measured expression. How would you do that? A pre-hearing submission, she said. File the ledger and my father's documentation as a formal exhibit with the board secretary before the hearing opens. Once it's entered into the record, any ruling has to account for it, regardless of what happens with the fraud case timeline. Donahue was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a tone that was as close to admiring as a precise man allowed himself to go, "Your father taught you well." "He taught me to read carefully," Clara said. "The law taught the rest." Donahue filed the pre-hearing submission the following morning. Daniel's letters arrived on the 5th day. They came in a bundle, 8 letters spanning 1868 to 1870, written in her father's hand. Donahue spread them on the table beside the ledger's notation pages and compared the handwriting with the methodical focus of a man who had done this work before. He went through every letter twice. He looked at specific letter formations, the way James Whitfield formed his lowercase d, the particular angle of his capital J, the consistent pressure pattern of a man who had spent decades writing careful records. "These will hold," Donahue said. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. "You knew before I confirmed it." "I recognized his handwriting the moment I opened the ledger," she said. "I just needed a court to recognize it too." Donahue nodded. He packed the letters carefully. Then he said, "There's something else you should know. Alcott came to my office yesterday." The room shifted slightly. Garrett, who had been standing near the window, turned. "What did he say?" Clara said. "He wants to cooperate," Donahue said. "He has records of the original contract negotiations conversations with Crowley about the terms of the debt arrangement and the marriage contract. He says Crowley directed him explicitly to structure Daniel's debt in a way that would make the marriage to Mr. Calloway the only viable resolution." "He'll testify to that," Garrett said. "He's asked for protection from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. He was complicit in the debt manipulation. He knows it." Donahue paused. "I told him I couldn't promise protection, but I could promise that voluntary cooperation would be noted in the record. He said he'd think about it." "He'll come," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "He was afraid," she said. Men who act out of fear rather than conviction don't hold their position when the ground shifts. The ground shifted at the auction when 40 people watched Crowley lose the room. Alcott has been recalculating since that morning. She paused. "He'll come." She was right. Alcott sent word that evening. He would appear at the hearing. The night before the hearing, Clara could not find stillness. She did not pace. Pacing was something she had trained herself out of years ago, because it read as anxiety, and she did not perform anxiety in front of anyone. But she moved through the house slowly from the kitchen to the front room and back, and she sat with her father's letters in her hands and read them in the lamplight, not for the handwriting, but for the words. He had written about the territory, about land and water and the particular quality of mountain summer. He had written about her and Daniel and Thomas with the specific practiced affection of a man who expressed love through observation rather than declaration, noting the way Clara analyzed problems, the way Daniel's loyalty ran deeper than his confidence, the way Thomas laughed at everything and needed to be taught when to stop. She had read these letters before. She had never read them sitting in a house in Harlan Ridge with her father's cleared name one day away. She heard Garrett on the stairs. She did not look up. He came into the front room and stopped when he saw what she was holding. He did not say anything for a moment. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "I will." He sat down in his chair. Not to talk, she understood, just to be in the room. She had learned over the past week that Garrett Calloway's presence was one of the few she had ever encountered that did not require management. He did not need her to perform composure. He did not need her to fill the silence. He simply occupied space in a way that made the space feel less empty, and she had stopped pretending she didn't find that useful. "Are you afraid?" he asked after a while. She considered the question honestly. "Not of the hearing," she said. "Donahue knows what he's doing, and the evidence is solid, and Crowley has run out of procedural moves that can stop it. I'm not afraid of that." "What then?" She was quiet for a moment. "After," she said. "I know what I came here for. I know what happens at the hearing tomorrow. I don't know what comes after." Garrett looked at her steadily. "What do you want to come after?" She had not let herself answer that question directly. She had kept it in the category of things requiring more information, which was the category she put things in when she was not ready to face them. She recognized that now. "I want my father's name cleared in a public record," she said. "I want my brothers to be free of debt and free of fear. I want the families on those 4 properties to receive restitution from Crowley's estate, because Donahue says the territorial court can order that, and I believe it will." She paused. "I want Frances Neal to get enough back to stop living in her daughter's house." "That's what you want for other people," Garrett said. She looked at him. "What do you want for yourself?" he said. The lamp was low between them. The summer night pressed against the windows. She held her father's letters in her hands and looked at Garrett Calloway, who had put a separate household clause in a marriage contract to protect a woman he had never met, who had turned around 12 miles from the county seat, because he did not want to leave her alone at night, who had said read her name first, and meant it from a place so deep it had no performance in it. "I don't know yet," she said, because that was the truth. "That's all right," he said. "Is it? You've been in survival for 3 years," he said. "You haven't had room to want things for yourself. That doesn't resolve in a week." He paused. "It doesn't resolve in a month." She looked at him. "How long does it take?" "I don't know," he said. "I'm still finding out." He said it without self-pity, the way he said most things, as a plain fact that didn't require dressing up. "What I know is, it goes faster when you're not doing it alone." The room was very quiet. "Garrett," she said. "Yes." "The contract," she said. "The legal term is 1 year. After that, either party can—" "I know what the contract says," he said. "I'm not telling you I'm leaving," she said carefully. "I'm saying I don't know yet, and I think you deserve to know that I don't know yet." He looked at her for a long time. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you for certainty." He paused. "I'm just telling you that when you figure out what you want, there's no debt attached to your answer. Either way." She absorbed that. She thought about the separate household clause. She thought about every moment in the past week when he had given her room rather than taken it, when he had accepted her correction on the letter, when he had let her go first, into the church storage, when he had moved to stand between her and Crowley. Not to rescue her, but to give her the 3 seconds she needed to finish what she was saying. "Thank you," she said, for all of it she meant. For everything that word covered. He nodded once. He stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's a long day." He went upstairs. Clara sat alone for a while with her father's letters and the quiet house, and the understanding settling into her now with the slow inevitability of water finding level that she was not the same person who had stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Ridge. That person had come here to survive. She was still here, and she was beginning carefully and without rushing to want things. The Territorial Review Board convened at 9 in the morning in the Harlan Ridge Courthouse, which was a room large enough to seat 40 and currently held closer to 60 because word had traveled in the particular unstoppable way of small territory news, and a great many people had decided they had business in town that morning. Donahue had pre-entered the ledger as Exhibit A and James Whitfield's letters as Exhibit B before the session opened. The board secretary confirmed their receipt. Crowley's attorney objected. The board chairman looked at the attorney for a brief, unremarkable moment and overruled the objection. That was the first thing that went right. Crowley sat at his counsel's table, with the careful stillness of a man who had decided on a posture and was holding it. He looked smaller than he had in the church hall, which Clara understood was not physical but contextual. A man looks different when he is no longer in control of the room's attention. She sat beside Donahue and kept her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly and looked at the board when she needed to look at something. The water rights review proceeded first. Crowley's attorney presented the survey defect argument with practiced efficiency. He was good, Clara noted this without feeling threatened by it. He understood the territorial statute, and he argued the procedural points with precision. Then Donahue presented the counter-argument. The survey document was fabricated, the defect inserted after the original filing, and the fabrication was consistent with a documented pattern of record falsification by the same party. He requested that the board examine Exhibit A. The board chairman opened the ledger. The room was very quiet while he read. The fraud testimony took 2 hours. Margaret Sills spoke first. She described receiving her relief payment in 1869, the amount that arrived what she had expected, and what she had believed for 15 years about the discrepancy. Her voice was steady the whole way through, except for one moment when she said her husband's name, and then she steadied it again and kept going. Ellen Drum spoke next. Brief, factual, exact. She said what had happened, and what she knew, and nothing else, and her precision was its own form of power. Frances Neal spoke last. She was small and wore her good dress, and she addressed the board chairman directly without looking at Crowley. She described losing her property in 1870. She described the $43 shortfall that she had never been able to account for. She said, "I know now where my money went." And she looked at the ledger on the board's table, and she did not say anything else, and she did not need to. Alcott testified fourth. He was pale and careful, and looked at no one at Crowley's table. He described the debt manipulation. He described Crowley's direction. He produced 3 written notes from his own files that Crowley had sent him during the contract negotiations, specific incriminating in Crowley's hand. Crowley's attorney objected 5 times during Alcott's testimony. The board chairman overruled 4 of them. On the 5th, he looked at the attorney and said in the flat tone of a man who has heard enough procedural noise, "Counselor, I'll hear the witness." That was the moment Clara knew it was finished. Crowley broke during the 3rd hour. Not dramatically, not the way stories sometimes tell it with a confession and a collapse. He broke the way careful men break when they have held a constructed reality for long enough, and the construction finally gives quietly from the inside in a way that shows first in the eyes. He leaned to his attorney and said something. The attorney frowned and said something back. Crowley said something else. The attorney set down his pen. "The board will take a short recess," the chairman said. During the recess, Clara sat in the corridor with Donahue, who was reviewing notes with the focused calm of a man who was not surprised by anything that happened in courtrooms. Garrett stood near the wall a few feet away, hat in his hands, watching the door. "What do you think he's doing?" Clara asked Donahue. "Calculating," Donahue said. "He's deciding whether to fight the fraud case or settle. If he fights it and loses, the territorial court can order full restitution plus penalty. If he negotiates now, he controls the terms more." "He'll try to negotiate," Clara said. "He'll try," Donahue agreed. "The question is what we accept." "Nothing that doesn't clear my father's name in the public record," Clara said immediately. "That's not negotiable." "Agreed," Donahue said. "What else?" "Full restitution to all 37 affected families, calculated from 1869 with interest." She paused. "The spring claim confirmed in Garrett's name permanently with no further right of petition from Crowley or his assigns." Donahue wrote it down. "Anything else?" She thought about Frances Neal in her good dress. "Compensation to Frances Neal specifically for the property she lost. Market value at the time of loss, not current assessment." Donahue looked up from his notes. "That's a specific ask." "She lost her home over $43, Clara said. "That's specific." Donahue nodded and wrote it down. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When the board reconvened, Crowley's attorney announced that his client wished to enter a cooperative resolution. The board chairman looked at Donahue. Donahue presented the terms. Crowley's attorney requested modifications on 2 minor points. Donahue countered. They agreed. The chairman read the resolution into the record. James Whitfield's name was cleared. The accusations made against him in the Harlan Ridge Community Meeting of 1870 were formally recanted and noted as based on falsified evidence. The spring claim on Callaway's North Ridge was confirmed permanent. Full restitution to 37 families was ordered from Crowley's estate holdings. Francis Neal's property compensation was specified by name. The chairman signed the resolution. The board secretary witnessed it. The seal went down. Clara sat at the table and listened to each line read and felt each one land, and she did not manage what it did to her face. And she did not look at Garrett, and she did not think about her father's last letter, or the church trunk, or the ink that didn't match. She just listened. She let the record be what it was. She let it be enough. Outside, the summer heat was complete and indifferent. The way summer is the way the world continues, while the lives inside it are being reshaped. Margaret Sills found her first, took both her hands and held them, and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. Ellen Drum nodded at her from a distance, with that same decisive, satisfied nod. Francis Neal was speaking with Donahue about the property compensation process, and Clara watched her stand a little straighter as he explained the timeline, and that straightening, that small physical fact of a woman recovering something that had been taken from her, was the thing that finally completely broke through the last of Clara's composure. She turned away and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood with her eyes closed for a moment in the summer sun. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Brief light, not intrusive there, and then removed, leaving the warmth of it behind. She opened her eyes. Garrett was standing beside her, looking at the courthouse steps rather than at her face, giving her privacy in the only way that was available to them on a public street. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was fine. She cleared it anyway. "Yes?" He nodded. He kept looking at the steps. "Mrs. Bryn will have opinions about how we spend the rest of the afternoon." A sound came out of Clara that surprised her. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sob, somewhere between the two. The sound a person makes when something very heavy has been set down, and the body doesn't quite know what to do without the weight. "She'll want to feed everyone," Clara said. "She will," he said. "She's already talking to Francis Neal about it." Clara looked across the street and saw that this was true. Mrs. Bryn was standing with Francis Neal and talking with the purposeful animation of a woman planning logistics. And Francis Neal was nodding, and her back was straight, and she was present in her own life, in a way that she had perhaps not been for a very long time. "Good," Clara said. "That's good." They stood together in the summer afternoon, and let the moment be what it was. The weeks after the hearing moved slowly at first, then gathered themselves into a different kind of rhythm. Donahue's office handled the restitution process. It was meticulous, bureaucratic, satisfying in the particular way that correct procedures are satisfying when you have spent years watching incorrect ones do damage. Clara assisted where she could, reading correspondence, checking figures, drafting responses on 3 occasions when Garrett's name needed to appear on documents, and he handed the pen to her and said, "Make sure it's right." She made sure it was right. Daniel wrote from Millbrook twice in the first week, and then once more a longer letter that arrived on a Wednesday morning, and that Clara read standing at the kitchen window before anyone else was up. He did not apologize again. He had done that in his first letter extravagantly, and she had written back to tell him that apologies had a place, and this wasn't it. What he did in the third letter was talk about their father memories Clara hadn't known. He had details she hadn't known he'd noticed. He wrote about the way their father had explained legal language to Clara when she was 9, pulling her onto a chair beside him and pointing at words and saying, not "What does this word mean?" but "What is this word trying to do?" She stood at the window and held the letter and thought about that. What is this word trying to do? She had been asking that question her whole life without knowing it. Garrett found her there 20 minutes later and saw the letter and didn't ask. He poured his coffee and sat at the table and waited in the way she had come to understand was simply how he was patient, not because he was withholding himself, but because he genuinely did not require explanation before it was ready. "Daniel wants to visit," she said. "When?" "He didn't say. He asked if it was all right." "It's all right," Garrett said. She looked at him. "You don't need to say that automatically." "I know," he said. "It's still all right." He drank his coffee. "Your brothers are part of what brought you here. They should see where you are." She looked back at the window. "He wants to see for himself that this is real." She paused. "That I'm not just surviving." "What will you tell him?" She thought about it. The honest answer, the full answer. "That I came here to survive," she said slowly, "and something happened to the definition." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to say it." "It's true," she said. She folded Daniel's letter and set it on the windowsill beside her mother's photograph, where it sat in the morning light next to the dried summer grass that had been replaced twice now, once by Mrs. Bryn without comment, and once on a morning when Mrs. Bryn was in town by Garrett, who had set a new small bunch on the sill and walked away without making it into anything. She had not made it into anything either. She had just let it be there. The conversation she had been carrying happened on a Saturday evening, 6 weeks after the hearing in the quiet that came after Mrs. Bryn had gone to her room, and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house had settled into the particular ease of a place that has been lived in long enough to have its own rhythms. They were in the front room. She was reading. He was doing something with a length of cord that involved a knot she didn't recognize and did not ask about. The lamp between them was comfortable. She said, "I know what I want." He didn't startle. He set down the cord. He looked at her. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because of the contract. The contract is a legal instrument, and we can revise it or dissolve it when Donahue thinks it's procedurally clean to do so." She held his gaze. "I want to stay because this is where I do my best thinking, and because Mrs. Bryn has stopped explaining things to me twice, and because I know where the creek sounds different in the afternoon, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because you turned around 12 miles from the county seat and you never once told me I was too much." Something moved across his face. "You're not too much," he said. "I know that," she said. "Now." The lamp burned between them. Outside, the summer night was warm and full of mountain sounds, the particular chorus of it, insects and wind and the far creek, and the occasional shift of the horses in the barn. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I have to tell you something." She waited. "When I agreed to the contract," he said, "I agreed to a legal arrangement. I agreed to the joint property clause because I needed the protection. I told you that. I told you truthfully." He paused. "What I didn't tell you is that when I sat across from you in Alcott's office and you refused to sit down and you read every word of the contract before you signed it and you asked about the separate household clause like it was the most natural question in the world. I thought, this is not a woman in trouble. This is a woman with a plan. And I wanted to know what the plan was." She looked at him. "You were curious about me?" "I was, yes," he said in the tone of someone selecting the correct word carefully. "I was curious about you. And I kept being curious. Every day." He looked at her with that open expression, the one she had learned was not practiced or performed. "That wasn't in the contract." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "I don't need you to feel the same way," he said. "I'm not saying this as a claim." "I know," she said. "You've never said anything as a claim." She set down her book. "Garrett, I came here not feeling anything on purpose because I couldn't afford to feel anything. That was real and it was necessary, and I don't apologize for it." She paused. "I stopped being able to maintain it sometime around the 3rd morning when I found you in the front room and you handed me coffee without asking me a single question about whether I was all right." He looked at her. "I noticed you," she said simply. "I kept noticing you. I just didn't know what to do with it yet." "And now," he said. "Now I know," she said. "I want to stay. I want to know what this is, what this becomes without the contract telling me what it has to be. I want to find out." She looked at him with the directness she had stopped apologizing for. "If you want that." Garrett Calloway, who was not a man who performed things, did not perform his answer. He reached across the space between their chairs, and he took her hand, and he held it the way you hold something you have been careful with for a long time and have finally decided you can trust yourself to hold properly. "I want that," he said. She looked at their hands. She thought about how far she had traveled. She thought about a stagecoach and summer dust and a leather satchel on her lap, and a woman who had decided she did not have room to want things for herself. She thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of a church ledger, careful and precise, building a case that had waited 15 years for someone to carry it home. She had carried it. She had carried it all the way here. And here was not what she had expected, and it was better than what she had feared, and it was hers genuinely. Hers. Not because a contract said so, but because she had walked into it with her eyes open and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular brand of courage that didn't look like courage from the outside, but felt from the inside like simply refusing to stop. She did not let go of his hand. "All right," she said, not as acceptance, as arrival. The specific declarative sound of a woman who has come a very long way and has finally completely meant what she said about staying. Outside the mountain, summer held the valley in its long, warm light, and the creek ran clean over its stones, and the north ridge, spring flowed into its creeks without dispute. And James Whitfield's name sat in a territorial record cleared and permanent and true. And Clara Whitfield, who had signed her name in a lawyer's office to save her family, who had read a church ledger in a locked room in the dark, who had stood in front of 40 people and read a dead man's careful work out loud, put her mother's photograph on a shelf that was hers to fill, in a house that was hers to stay in, beside the man who had turned around. That was enough. That was everything. That was where the story ended, not in rescue, not in resolution from the outside, but in a woman who had finally given herself permission to be in the right place and know it.